I am a lawyer, but I am not necessarily your lawyer. The materials discussed in this podcast are for informational purposes only and should not be deemed legal advice. If you have a specific legal question according to your circumstances, then I encourage you to speak with an attorney licensed in your jurisdiction. Welcome back to another edition of Ag Law Today. And today we're going to talk with Lauren Handel again from the East Coast on the produce safety rule. Lauren, I know that you were on this podcast before, but why don't you reintroduce yourself to our listeners? Tell us who you are, where you are, and a little bit more about your law practice.
Sure. I have a law practice that's called Handel Food Law, and I'm based in northern New Jersey. And my clients are all food businesses. So I represent and advise businesses that are farms, manufacturers, importers, distributors, retailers, restaurants, even some caterers. The common thing being that they're all in the food industry, but I provide a variety of legal services for them. It's a kind of a general small business practice focused on food.
Excellent. So we're going to talk about the produce safety rule. And this is a newish law. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about the background? When did this come into play, and what was the old law before this was administered?
Sure. Well, in 2011, Congress enacted the Food Safety Modernization Act, which has a variety of components to it, all with the common theme of trying to be more proactive in preventing food safety problems rather than reactive. There had been a lot of foodborne illness outbreaks, and this was a way to try to address that by requiring certain legal steps be taken by all different kinds of food businesses to try to prevent foodborne illness from happening in the first place. Part of it is the produce safety rule, which is focused on produce, fresh fruits and vegetables.
So who exactly is covered under the produce safety rule?
There's a few elements of who and what is covered. The first being that it applies to farms, right? So farms are kind of what you would traditionally think a farm is. It's a place where produce, fruits and vegetables are grown, but it's also places where they are harvested, which includes a variety of activities that aren't just the pulling it out of the ground or taking it off of the tree, but also things incident to harvesting. The packing and holding of produce also are covered. And so even a location owned by a farm that's not on the same physical property as where the produce is grown, but where it's stored or washed, handled, sorted, prepared for market is also part of the farm. The other main part of what's covered is this: we're talking about fruits and vegetables, but we're not talking about every kind of fruit and vegetable because, again, the idea is that we're talking about the risk and trying to prevent the risk of foodborne illness. So the law is focused on fruits and vegetables that are commonly consumed raw, as opposed to anything that would get cooked, like potatoes are excluded.
So I used to live in New York City, and I feel like urban agriculture was the new black there, everybody with their rooftop farm. And I loved it. Absolutely loved going to visit some of those rooftop farms, especially in Brooklyn. And would rooftop farms fit under the definition of the farm under the produce safety rule?
They would. All right, so it's really anywhere that fruits and vegetables are grown. There is an exemption for really small produce farms. So if the total value of the produce a farm sells in a year is less than $25,000, it's excluded. But other than that, at least in theory, is covered by the rule. There are some other exemptions, but yes.
So are there any other exemptions that are worth noting there under the produce safety rule?
Sure. So as I mentioned, not all kinds of produce are covered. So there is a specific list in the regulations of produce that's not commonly consumed raw. A lot of it is things you would expect. But if To the extent that a farm is only growing those types of produce, then it would be entirely excluded. There are also an exclusion if the produce is not going to be consumed raw, in the sense that if you're growing it to sell it to a canner, if it's going to undergo some type of processing that includes a kill step that would eliminate the risk of any sort of pathogen, then that's also not covered. So those are entire exclusions. There's also what's called a qualified exemption, which is, it's an exemption from almost all of the requirements of the rule. And that applies only if the farm has sales of $500,000 or less in a year, and that's an average over the last 3 years. And if most of their sales are either direct to consumer or to restaurants or retailers within the state or within 275 miles.
And briefly, you were mentioning about very small farms being exempt if it was less than 25,000. Was that gross revenues for the farm?
That's sales of produce only.
Produce only. And what can a farmer get in trouble, or what kind of trouble can a farmer get into if he or she fails to comply with the produce safety rule?
Sure. So this is going to vary somewhat state by state, because the way that these regulations are going to be implemented and enforced is primarily in most states through an agreement that FDA has with each state. So there are a few states that aren't participating in this, in which FDA will be the enforcement agency. FDA still is responsible for implementation of these rules overall, but the day-to-day is going to get handled by most of the states and their individual state departments of agriculture. So the actual enforcement and penalties will vary somewhat with state law, and that remains somewhat to be seen. But just in general, as a general proposition, when a company is found to be in violation of some food safety regulation, the usual penalty or action that the agency takes in response to that is a warning. So I know a lot of people are really concerned that there is going to be really high fines or jail time, and people remember the big 2011, the Jensen Farms cantaloupe listeria outbreak that got a lot of people sick, and that led to criminal prosecution of the farmers involved in that. That's a really extreme example of food safety enforcement. By and large, what happens is, and what FDA has committed to in this case, is especially early on, is that they're going to take an educational approach with this and not seek any sort of real formal penalties for violations.
So, Lauren, I was at an agriculture conference a few months ago, and a farmer came up to me, and he was a little concerned about the produce safety rule. He was curious on whether or not he had greater liability, potential liability, because of the produce safety rule. What are your thoughts there on that?
Yeah, I hear this too, and unfortunately, I don't think people will like my answer. But my answer is it depends, but probably no. I mean, probably the enactment of these regulations will not affect a farmer's liability because they're going to be liable no matter what anyway. The reality is that in most states, as a general rule of law, there is strict product liability. If you sell a defective product and contaminated produce counts, and you make a customer sick, then it doesn't matter how much you did to try to prevent that from happening, because it's not a negligence standard. Now, if there's a state where a negligence standard applies, and I don't know specifically in every state what the law is on this, and it's actually something that's the subject of research right now. But if a negligence standard applies, meaning that a producer can be held liable only if they failed to exercise reasonable care under the circumstances, then yes, then this law and the regulations could have an impact, because they could be construed as defining what is reasonable care. And in some states, and the law is that if there is a law or a regulation that's directly on point to the type of injury that occurs, then violating that law or regulation is considered negligence per se. And so it could just make it easier to prove in that situation that a farmer was liable. But again, I think the usual rule is going to be strict liability, which means it doesn't matter how much you did, how good you were, even if you did everything you could to try to prevent this illness from happening. If it happens and it was your product, you're going to be held liable, and that's why you need to have insurance.
So, in other words, I answered the question to this farmer correctly because I said it depends. So,
That's right.
All right, Lauren, could we walk through a little bit of compliance steps for a farmer? Let's say this farmer is not a very small farm and they're not exempt. So walk me through some of the big steps that this farmer should take in order to have compliance with the produce safety rule.
Well, you definitely want to, if there's any possibility of fitting within the qualified exemption, then you want to look closely at your sales numbers and see if that qualified exemption applies, because qualified exemption is really all you have to do if you fit within that exemption is maintain records to show that your sales qualify you for the exemption, and make sure that when you sell your produce, it's labeled with the farm where it's grown.
And that's the qualified exemption is, I know that $500,000, I believe that was the threshold. And so you're talking about less than $500,000?
Less than $500,000, and that's as opposed to the $25,000 total exemption. We're talking now about sales of all food. So if you sell some produce, but you also sell grains or meats or dairy or anything else, then you need to count all of that towards that $500,000. And it's an average again over the last 3 years, and it's also adjusted for inflation. So it's actually more than $500,000 now, because that was $500,000 back in 2011.
Okay, got it. So step one, check your books, see if you fit under the qualified exemption. So what's the next step? Let's say the farm has $750,000, $750,000 of total revenue. So they don't fit under the exemption.
Right. So there are a lot of training opportunities available, and it actually is a requirement of the law that you have someone who is involved in the management of the farm who has been trained. So that would be the next step, is to educate yourself on everything involved, and get that training so that you can satisfy that part of the law too, to be a qualified individual who's received the appropriate training.
Lauren, do you know much about that training? Is it a day? Is it an hour? Is it half a day? Is it online?
I don't know. I know that the FDA has partnered with different organizations in different regions around the country to make that training available, but I don't know the specifics of it.
Got it. All right. So let's say they've went through the training, they've got the little certificate. What's another step that they need to do to make sure that they're compliant?
Yeah, I mean, so the basic idea would be creating a food safety plan for the whole farming operation, and there are a variety of required aspects of that, including water safety, and depending on your source of water, there are different testing requirements and record keeping requirements, training of employees and documenting all of that. There are steps that have to be taken with respect to livestock and wild animals, and their intrusion or presence in the areas where produce is grown. So they're procedures that have to be created and implemented, and always records kept. So they'll require some advanced planning.
So this is a pretty substantive document. Are there samples online? Do farmers just start from scratch? Do they work with a consultant? What would be the game plan there?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, the training resources are going to be invaluable. I mean, unless it's a farm that has the resources to hire a food safety consultant to create this type of plan for them, then you're going to need to get that training. And, the extension services are really valuable for that. And these training networks that have been set up in partnership with FDA have those types of resources, including model farm plans.
So besides consulting with a food lawyer like yourself, are there other professionals that you would suggest reaching out to, such as maybe an extension education agent?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. The extension services will be invaluable in this.
All right. Did I miss anything as far as compliance steps there for the farm?
I mean, there's going to be a lot of nitty gritty, and it's going to depend very much on the circumstances of each farm, which I'm not at all qualified to advise people on. And the types of issues that I'd say you go to a lawyer for would be for helping you figure out if you even have to comply with the rule at all. And if there is a way to structure your operations so that maybe you don't have to comply, or that you can minimize your compliance burdens, which may be possible in some circumstances. Lawyers can help with those kinds of things. And then if you get in trouble, if you have a dispute with a regulatory agency, then that's another place where a lawyer can step in. But the actual nitty-gritty of compliance is really for food safety professionals, not for lawyers.
Well, you maybe think a little bit more about operations with multiple farmers working together. Let's say that there's an LLC and myself, my brother, and my father are a member of. In determining that $500,000 threshold, would you be looking at the entire operation, the entire LLC, or would it be a times 3 because there's 3 individuals that are owners of the LLC?
Yeah, so all of this turns on the definition of a farm in the regulation, and those sales thresholds apply to the farm. And the farm is defined as a place. It's actually defined as a place that's under one management. Mm-hmm. And so an LLC might own multiple farms. And it might be difficult or not the way that you normally do your accounting to separate that out per farm. Mm. But for purposes of this rule, and especially if it's likely that some of the farms are exempt and others aren't, then it might be valuable to actually do your accounting in a way so that you could figure that out and prove it to an enforcement agency if you had to show that part of your operations is exempt, even if it's all under the same LLC.
All right, very interesting. So last question for you, and then we'll wrap up. I know that last time I asked you how our listeners could find the right agricultural lawyer near them, and you recommended talking to your friends, talking to colleagues, trying to get those referrals. Let's say that they're in a consultation with a prospective ag lawyer. Is there a question or two that you recommend that farmer ask that attorney to make sure that he or she knows their stuff and is the right fit for their farm?
That's an interesting question. I can't say that I've thought about that specifically before. I think it's great to ask about experience, recognizing that lawyers can't reveal their clients' confidences. So without naming names, to ask a lawyer to describe situations where they've handled something similarly, to see if they actually have relevant experience, or even if they don't. I mean, lots of times people call me and they have really unique issues that I haven't exactly confronted before. And I think what's important there is to know that your lawyer has the skills to figure it out, even if they haven't handled exactly the same situation. So to kind of find out how they would approach it, and see how candid they're being, and exactly what they're saying about the level of work that's going to be involved and how much it's going to cost is always really important to find out, because you definitely don't want to be surprised by your legal bills.
Yeah, I think those are all good points. And I fear that a lot of farmers tend to just work with either the attorney that their family has always worked with, or the attorney that's in their rural community, and which he or she may be a great attorney, but perhaps on these more specific food and agriculture issues, you should consult with a different professional that may work with that local attorney as well. So, Lauren, how can people find you on the interwebs, and are you involved in social media?
I am. I have a website, which is handelfoodlaw.com. And you can also find my firm on Facebook and on Twitter and also on LinkedIn.
All right, excellent. Thanks again for coming back. Looking forward to the next time. We'll have to think about a new topic for that one.
Thank you very much.